So starting in the summer of 2017, scholars and journalists that regularly reported on the Xinjiang province of the People's Republic of China, also known as Uyghurstan or East Turkestan, began noticing something strange and alarming. Uyghur international students at universities abroad were being called back to China by the Communist Party. Uyghurs in China started contacting their families abroad and advising them not to contact them. Perhaps most disconcerting is Uyghur scholars, imams, activists, and community leaders in Uyghurstan started disappearing. At the same time, the world started to learn about a tremendous increase in the securitization of the region. The first sign was the unprecedented development of a widespread system of surveillance. Virtually every Uyghur was being watched over and spied on by the state. There's the physical presence of frequent and spontaneously created checkpoints, the proliferation of military and police stations, and the installation of video cameras in nearly all public spaces, replete with facial recognition software. The surveillance state even encroaches upon the private lives of Uyghurs in China. Spyware with GPS tracking capabilities is forcibly installed on people's smartphones, allowing the state to not only track their individuals, but also listen in on their conversations and collect data on the media that they're consuming. The most extreme and dystopic element of this surveillance state is the nearly 1 million Communist Party agents that have been assigned to visit and even live with Uyghur families. As you can see, and the slides are a little phased out, but this is a picture of a Uyghur child sitting with a Communist Party agent that has been assigned to live with their family. And he's reading them a children's book called One China. If this sounds too incredulous to believe, it's sadly only the first act in a tragic play we might call the Uyghur cultural genocide. By 2018, human rights groups were reporting that between 1 to 2 million Uyghurs, that's larger than the size of the greater Richmond metro area, and other Turkic minorities were being arbitrarily imprisoned in quote-unquote re-education camps. Now, what comes to mind? What would you imagine the term re-education to entail? You might think about a university program or a government program that helps train individuals to take on new jobs, to tackle new industries that are coming into their area. But unfortunately, these camps more closely resembled prisons than universities. Detainees were subject to hours of communist propaganda each day. Much of this quote-unquote education involved denigrating Islam and traditional Uyghur culture as dangerous ideologies. Detainees were forced to speak Chinese, and some reports even claim that Uyghurs were not allowed to speak to one another in casual conversation. There have also been reports of severe torture, and in some cases of detainees being forced to ingest unknown substances and drugs. At first, the People's Republic of China denied the existence of such camps. But as documentary evidence became available via the internet, the Communist Party acknowledged their existence, but only as institutions of workforce training and cultural advancement. When this recording becomes available via YouTube, you'll be able to see these pictures a little bit better. But 3 of these pictures are satellite imagery of camps that have popped up in the last couple of years. And this is the evidence that has been put forth against the Communist Party of China. And also photos have emerged from some of these camps demonstrating the disciplinary and quote-unquote educational initiatives that are going on. As over 1 million individuals of an ethnic minority were herded into camps, the world stood by with little more than shallow disapproval. How was it that the Chinese Communist Party was able to perpetrate such a large-scale, systematic oppression of their indigenous ethnic and religious minority in the northwest of their country. What reasons do they have to engage in such atrocities? What could they possibly seek to accomplish with these policies? And why has the world, and the Muslim world in particular, sat idly by as human rights crises have unfolded before our very eyes? In order to understand the answer to these questions, we first have to understand who the Uyghur people are and how they fit into the context of contemporary China. The Uyghurs are actually a Turkic people. They're an amalgamation of several different types of ethnic groups in the area, related linguistically and historically to other Central Asian groups, such as the Uzbeks, and to a lesser extent, the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, and the Turkmen. This ancestry is much more distinct, and this is an important note, this ancestry is more distinct than from the majority of the population of China, which is Han Chinese. The Uyghur homeland, if you can see it from this map, is often referred to as Uyghurstan or East Turkestan by the Uyghurs themselves. And I'll use these two names interchangeably throughout this presentation. The Chinese government formally named the region the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, or Xinjiang for short. It is the largest province in China at approximately 620,000 square miles, with approximately 25 million inhabitants, of which 11.3 million are Uyghurs. It's actually the 8th largest subdivision of a country in the world. Islam became widespread among the Uyghurs in the 10th century with the conversion of the ruling family at the time, the Kara Khanate. East Turkestan, or Uyghurstan, was much like other parts of Central Asia in that it was subject to repeated conquests and continuous war by a plethora of different groups, though always within the orbit of the various Chinese empires to the east. Uyghurstan came under the direct control of the Chinese in the 18th century with an invasion by the Qing dynasty. Scholars have traditionally shied away from describing this relationship between the Han Chinese and the Uyghurs as colonialism, but there is a reason to believe today that it is an appropriate term. Mainly because the Han conquered and occupied East Turkestan, the Uyghurs have been seen as objectively different from and inferior to the Han. This has contributed to a classic colonial dilemma in which various Chinese states have failed to assimilate the Uyghurs, just as Europeans have failed to, quote-unquote, civilize their various colonial subjects throughout the world. The Qing dynasty gave way to the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek in the early 20th century. And after that, rebellions broke out in Xinjiang, and the Chinese governor at the time employed Russian monarchists, who are called White Russians, to break up these rebellions. So the Chinese were bringing in foreign soldiers to quell the rebellion. When the Bolsheviks gained control of Russia, the Soviet Union began backing separatist movements in Xinjiang, leading to several breakaway republics. Before the advent of the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong, there were 2 autonomous and fully formed republics of East Turkestan, though they never gained full control of the Xinjiang region. The People's Liberation Army, led by Mao Zedong, entered East Turkestan in 1949 and quickly dispatched the former Chinese governor and his forces. In 1955, the new People's Republic of China dubbed East Turkestan the Autonomous Xinjiang region. The region was largely neglected by communist authorities, however, but economic development in Xinjiang increased more in the northern areas where large numbers of Han Chinese were concentrated. This neglect took place from 1949 when it was conquered all the way to about the 1970s and 80s. But this disparity in the development of the North and the South, the North having a majority Han Chinese and the South where the concentration of Uyghurs were, led to a slow and steady growth in economic inequality between the Uyghurs and the Han, which contributed to growing resentment over the years. By the 1990s, grumblings for Uyghur independence were growing to a resounding pitch. Han Chinese were and continue to be more educated, more wealthy, and employed in higher paying and more powerful positions. Urban areas have become increasingly segregated, much like Jim Crow era South cities in the United States. And independence movements like the Turkestan Islamic Party began attacking government institutions, police and military officials, and Han civilians, starting in the early 2000s. Violent attacks increased and became problematic for the communist regime in Beijing. In 2014, communist leaders in Xinjiang launched the People's War, they called it. It is a campaign against the alleged three evils that they defined as separatism, terrorism, and extremism. Under the direction of Zhang Shuang, and I must admit I'm probably butchering all of these names, so forgive me, there was instituted a program called the Civil Servant Family Pair-Up Program. This is the program that I spoke about a few minutes ago, in which thousands of communist agents moved to Xinjiang and lived with family members, Uyghur family members. But President Xi Jinping was unhappy with the progress and soon replaced Sun Qian with another party official that had experience with untaming unruly minorities. His name was Chen Quanguo, who I'm just going to refer to as Chen. Chen made his reputation in the Tibetan region to the south prior to being stationed in Xinjiang. He developed a reputation. He's actually the first member of the Communist Party to rule over two different provinces of China. And he made his reputation in Tibet starting in 2011, after there was a tumultuous period of unrest in Tibet. The Chinese Communist Party was subjecting Tibetan monks and Tibetan nuns to persecution, preventing them from practicing their religion, and the monks and nuns responded with nonviolent protests. Shen Kongguao was assigned authority over Tibet. He immediately hired police and military officials and set up military checkpoints throughout major cities. He started arresting monks and nuns en masse, demolishing monk temples and schools. And in 2016, after he had effectively quelled the revolution or the rebellion or the unrest in Tibet, was then sent to Xinjiang to wrap up the unrest that was unfolding there. Tens of thousands of security personnel were recruited immediately under Chen's authority, and they were given authority to use lethal force. There are several statements from Chen that are very provocative in nature, where he essentially says that we have come to obliterate any sort of resistance, to wipe out all forms of extremism, and to eliminate all notions of separatism. He accelerated the Civil Servant Family Pair-Up Program, and reports started to surface about fabricated images that are, as I've got presented here, images of happy Uyghur families with one or two communist agents with them. These look like images that you might find in a family album. But reports started to surface that these agents were less than cordial to their hosts. In some instances, there were reports of male communist agents living with female Uyghurs and even sleeping in the same bed with them after the Uyghur husband had been detained and taken to a camp. Shen Kongguao accelerated the destruction of religious centers such as mosques. This is a picture actually before Chen Kongguao took over authority. This goes back all the way to 2011. This is a bombed out mosque in Xinjiang. And most importantly, or what has garnered perhaps the most attention, and I will tell you why, is the concerted effort to erase the Uyghur language. Most recently, in 2021, the Communist Party outlawed standard Uyghur language textbooks that had been popular since their publishing in the early 2000s, they had claimed that these textbooks contain passages that preach separatism and extremism. The reason that this is important is because of the word genocide. In the subtext to the title of this lecture is called Uyghurs Under Siege, which is a common hashtag on Twitter, but it's also called cultural genocide in Western China. And the reason we say cultural genocide is because the term genocide is extremely controversial. To be charged with the crime of genocide in the International Criminal Court of Justice requires a tremendous amount of evidence, but it also requires evidence of intent. And that's why the International Criminal Court of Justice oftentimes hears cases of human rights abuse or war crimes because they're much easier to prove. The term genocide is very emotionally laden. The reason we use the term cultural genocide is because it's very apparent from the systematic persecution that is taking place by the Communist Party that the Han Chinese are trying to wipe out the Uyghur culture as it exists. There have not been many reports of massacres or killings, at least not to the significant extent that we think of Bosnia or Rwanda or the Holocaust of the 1930s and 40s. But there is a concerted effort to erase the language, the cultural practices, and the religion of the Uyghur people. And that is why the term cultural genocide is used, because there is evidence to suggest that the Communist Party is seeking to wipe out the Uyghur culture. Now, why would they do this? In most cases, it is blamed on the ideology of communism itself, or the authoritarian nature of the Communist Party of China, that disparate cultures, languages, or any sort of rallying element will allow people to break away from China, to seek autonomy or independence. That's why, at the beginning of this lecture, when we saw the picture of the young child reading the book with the communist agent, the book was called One China. That one China, that vision of one China that the Communist Party has, is a China under the rule of the Communist Party and the ethnic Han. How is this sort of massive oppression allowed to exist is another good question. Come on back, there we go. And many scholars have blamed, ironically, that the Chinese have been able to institute the deportation, the detention of over 1 million to 2 million Uyghurs in concentration camps because of the war on terror. Because the Uyghurs are a Muslim minority, the Chinese Communist Party has taken advantage of a global wave of Islamophobia to paint Uyghurs as terrorists. If we go back to the three evil forces that the People's War is supposed to combat in China, it was extremism, terrorism, and separatism. The first two, as American Muslims, we are familiar with. Claims of being extremist, claims to terrorism, are thin veils that are used to label any sort of behavior or attitude that the Communist Party does not agree. And ironically, even as senators, congressmen, and women throughout the United States are starting to increasingly talk more about this, scholars are saying that we actually have some responsibility to bear by creating a culture from the war on terror that would allow these actions to exist. And it's very unfortunate that we might expect opposition to arise in the Muslim world. And yet, it is the Muslim world, at least the governments of the Muslim world, that have been the most quiet. And I want to share with you now, the audio is a little choppy, the video is not quite bright, but I want to share with you now an interview that came out a couple of months ago from Axios. If you might remember, I think it's Jonathan something is the reporter. He got really famous because he interviewed Donald Trump. You might remember him from that. And Donald Trump was waving graphs about COVID that he thought proved something or another. That same reporter took on Imran Khan and asked him about Pakistan's complicity or their inability to recognize the crimes that were happening across the border in China. So I'm going to take a few minutes to play that, and we'll talk about that afterwards.
Last year, you wrote an open letter to leaders of Muslim states asking them to unite against Islamophobia, particularly in the West. Why did you feel the need to write that public letter?
The problem is there's this big communication gap between the Islamic world and the Western societies. It happened after 9/11, when the word Islamic terrorism came into currency. The moment you say Islamic terrorism, the man in the street in the West thinks that there's something in Islam which leads to terrorism, or Islam causes radicalism. After 9/11, any time some terrorist act went on where a Muslim was involved, the entire 1.3 billion Muslims started becoming targets.
Just across your border in Western China, the Chinese government has imprisoned more than 1 million Uyghur Muslims in re-education camps. The Chinese government has tortured Muslims, forcibly sterilized them, and they've destroyed mosques in Xinjiang, and also punished Muslims for fasting, praying, even giving Muslim names to their children. Prime Minister, why are you so outspoken about Islamophobia in Europe and the United States, but totally silent about the genocide of Muslims in Western China?
What our conversations have been with the Chinese, this is not the case, according to them.
The evidence is just overwhelming.
Whatever issues we have with the Chinese, we speak to them behind closed doors. China has been one of the greatest friends to us in our most difficult times. When we were really struggling, our economy was struggling, China came to our rescue. So we respect the way they are, and whatever issues we have, we speak behind closed doors. How come this is such a big issue in the Western world? Why are the people of Kashmir ignored? It is much more relevant. Compared to what might be going in the Uyghurs, 100,000 Kashmiris have been killed. There are 800,000 Indian troops which have, literally, it's an open prison in Kashmir. 9 million Kashmiris are put there. Why is that not an issue? So I think it's hypocrisy.
They've been a huge partner to you, China, but on some level, doesn't it make you feel sick to have to be quiet because of all this money they're putting into Pakistan?
I look around the world, what's happening in Palestine, Libya, Somalia, Syria, Afghanistan. Am I going to start talking about everything? I concentrate on what is happening on my border, in my country.
This is on your border.
Which is part of, no, that is part of Pakistan. 100,000 Kashmiris are dying. That concerns me more, because half of Kashmir is in Pakistan.
This is a grotesquely large human rights atrocity.
First of all, I'm not sure about that, because our conversations with the Chinese, this is not the picture that comes from that side.
So just to put a fine point on this, you are not in any way concerned about the Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang?
Our discussions with Chinese will always be behind closed doors.
So Imran Khan's comments here are fascinating for a lot of different reasons. He's actually perhaps one of the more articulate Muslim leaders in the world when it comes to this issue. And from a certain perspective, his response is quite masterful. But I'm actually going to open it up real quick to y'all and see, what did you notice about the way he spoke about this issue that was unique? In other words, how did he handle a question like this in a way that tried to perhaps not put blame on him for being silent, and also not anger the Chinese? Yeah, Brother Sharif.
First of all, he flipped the script. He went away from question and got into Kashmir and said that's more important than him. I heard that correctly.
Yeah.
Let me concentrate on my country, get my Muslim brother.
So in a sense, he came from a realist perspective that his authority is over one certain geographic region, right? And his authority over that region has its own crisis within it, and that is the crisis of Kashmir. And he harps on the crisis of Kashmir because his constituents are concerned about that. He's a good elected official, actually. He's saying, my authority doesn't extend to the people of China. I have my own crisis, and that's the crisis that concerns me. In that way, he's quite masterful in what he has to say. He also deflects in another couple of cases. He mentions that there are several other crises that are happening around the world, in Palestine and in Libya, right? Does anyone else have any thoughts about that? Yeah, Murtaza?
Oh, I was going to bring up how he says we talk behind closed doors. So if he keeps mentioning that, if you're watching, you could think, oh, maybe he is doing something about it, but he's just not telling us. And then the Chinese can look at that and they say, he's not saying anything really negative about us either. So
Yeah.
when you say we talk behind closed doors, it implies that there's a lot of different possibilities, and maybe it's the one that you want to be the reality is actually going on.
Exactly. So mentioning the talk behind closed doors does a couple of things. Muslim audiences or audiences that are concerned about the Uyghur crisis might take that as a hint, a very implicit hint, that there are conversations that are happening, that perhaps Prime Minister Imran Khan is actually consulting the Chinese about the crisis that's unfolding and doing whatever is in his limited power to do so. As you mentioned as well, the Chinese could look at a statement like that and say, you're not actually admitting anything other than, that we talk behind closed doors. It also serves Prime Minister Khan in the sense that it demonstrates that he has a close enough relationship that he's actually talking to the Chinese behind closed doors. That elevates his clout as being someone that's connected to a significantly stronger country to the north. Anything else? Yeah, Fred?
Well, it's kind of ironic in a way that he would, write a piece about Islamophobia in the West, and then as soon as he's kind of confronted about, the Islamophobia right on his border, all of a sudden he has to concentrate on the crisis in Kashmir.
Yes.
So previously he was very concerned about things outside of his borders. As soon as he's confronted, now he has to concentrate on the stuff within his borders.
Yes, exactly. And ironically, if you dabble on Twitter, this comes up that there are Muslims, Pakistanis in particular, that deny, just as Prime Minister Khan did, that there may not be as big of a crisis going on as we think. Right? He says, the Chinese tell us that's not exactly what's happening. There are supporters of Imran Khan that would like to believe that he's not sitting by idly as this is happening in his neighbor's backyard. There is also, which you mentioned, Fred, is a pivot, right? Oftentimes, people who want to deny that anything is happening in China are quick to say, well, look at what Western countries have done to the Muslim world. And the irony is that there's truth in that United States foreign policy, Western foreign policy has contributed to lives lost, negative sentiment about Islam and Muslims around the world. But of course, that's not the problem on the table right here that Jonathan is approaching Imran Khan about. He is asking specifically about the situation in Uyghurstan. So it is another type of deflection and something that we see defenders of this policy do. So I want to leave today with some questions about what is it that we can actually do? Unfortunately, it's not a lot in Richmond, Virginia, that we individuals, but there are things that we can do. The first is to continue to get educated, to pick up as many books as you can. And I actually have a book that is propping up the projector right here that I owe a deep debt to in preparing this presentation by Sean Roberts, who worked for the United Nations and wrote a book called The War on the Uyghurs. It's a tremendous book. There are other books that are coming out now. This is a relatively new phenomenon, but there are plenty of articles to get educated as much as you can about the situation. There's also organizations that you can follow on Twitter that also have newsletters that are constantly updating, that are running campaigns to raise money for Uyghurs in refugee camps in Kazakhstan, next door, for example. Some of those are the the Uyghur Human Rights Project, the World Uyghur Conference, and Campaign for Uyghurs. There's several organizations out there that are doing great things. There are constant boycotts that are going on, and just recently, within the last couple of days, the World Uyghur Conference came out with Care National to announce a boycott on Hilton. Hilton has recently announced the development of a large hotel in Xinjiang, which in and of itself is not problematic. It is the parcel of real estate that it is being built on, which is upon the grounds of a mosque that was destroyed by the Communist Party within the last couple of years. So obviously that has hurt the Uyghurs, that the Hilton Corporation would build a hotel on the remains of a mosque, and has just issued this boycott within the last couple of days. And then finally, we have the honor of having an elected official here in the room with us. And believe it or not, they actually take seriously when you reach out to them. And we have a success story in this case. So I wouldn't suggest reaching out to your state representatives and senators because they don't have control over any foreign policy. But our congressional senators, Senator Tim Kaine and Senator Mark Warner. Mark Warner in particular because he sits on the Senate Committee for Foreign Affairs. He has significant power, and because Mark Warner has actually been receptive to Muslim community concerns about the Uyghur crisis. We've had members of this community in Richmond have reached out to Mark Warner and said, hey, we want you to talk more about this and bring attention to it. And he's actually listened to us, and he's adjusted his speeches. He's brought it up numerous times in committee. So he's been very receptive. And it goes to show that that was just a single individual speaking on behalf of our community. So our elected officials do listen to us if we do launch a campaign to get their attention. Those are just a couple of things that we can do. I wish I could say the prospects for this situation being resolved were positive. But because of China's rise as a world power, because China contributes significantly to development in neglected parts of the world, such as Africa and Asia, it's very unlikely that there will be any sort of foreign intervention. No one is interested in waging a war on China on behalf of a beleaguered indigenous and ethnic religious minority, unfortunately. With that being said, we can always pray and hope that the situation begins to resolve. It is not typical that authoritarian regimes can keep this up for long without facing some sort of pressure. China has faced economic sanctions from other countries because of this behavior. And though economic sanctions have a mixed record, it's better than sitting idly by as we do nothing. So I want to thank all of you for coming out. I just want to take a few seconds to talk about my project, Citizen Scholar. This is a project that I came up with. Really, the seed of it was planted on January 6, 2021. As I was pacing through my study, I was trying to work on my dissertation, but as you're probably familiar, there was an insurrection taking place at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And I had a hard time concentrating on my work as this was happening. I reflected on the culmination of events that got us to this point where U.S. citizens were trying to storm the Capitol to prevent the electoral institutions of this country working. And I was particularly distraught that my colleagues in political science departments around the country had very little to say and were ironically surprised that such a thing had happened. I feel like we can look back on that now and say we shouldn't have been surprised after all the rhetoric, all the bigotry that had seeped its way into our politics in the last couple of years, that would be the product of it. So I started Citizen Scholar with the question of what is it that I can do as a lowly political science PhD student to try and save the republic, or at least try and do my part in the Richmond area to educate citizens, to help them root out misinformation that is so prevalent today, to make them more energetic about being involved in the political process, and to just make us better citizens. Citizens that can sit at the same table with people that we disagree with and still be cordial. citizens that understand policy at a more complex level than we currently do. I have that vision for the city of Richmond. I think that we can do it, and this is my project to see if we can accomplish that. This is the first public lecture I'll be giving. I plan to give more public lectures at places like libraries in Chesterfield and Henrico County. I have 2 lectures I'm working on now. One is on polarization, about the massive increase in polarization in our country and how we got to the point where Democrats and Republicans literally won't talk to each other, and what we can do about that. And I have another lecture that I'm preparing on voting rights, because voting rights are under siege in places like Texas and Georgia and other Republican-controlled states mostly. And we'll explore the history of voter suppression and its manifestation today. And luckily, I think in Virginia, we have, at the moment, gotten beyond that. But as you know, with every election, we're in a state of precarity. So I implore all of you to go out. If you are unaware, yesterday was the first day of early voting for the election coming up. So go out there, vote as early as you can. You don't really even need a reason to vote early, but just get it out of the way. Do your research and vote for those people that are going to be good for our Commonwealth. So with that, I want to thank you for coming here, and I'll open it up for questions. So I must